Here's what I keep coming back to. For approximately 400 years, the largest named territorial designation on the face of the Earth appeared on nearly every serious European map ever printed. Not a small region, not an obscure annotation. The largest, Grand Tartary. You can look this up. It is not disputed. At its greatest extent on these maps, Tartaria covered more of the planet's landmass than the Roman Empire at its peak, more than the British Empire at its widest reach, more than any political designation that Western civilization has since decided deserves its own dedicated chapter in a standard history textbook. I want to be careful here because this is where most discussions of this topic lose their footing and lose me with them. I am not saying Tartaria was a hidden super civilization. I am not claiming the mud flood theories are real. I am making a narrower and quieter observation. I am saying this. It was on the maps consistently for 4 centuries, with increasing internal detail over time, and then the word essentially disappeared from the vocabulary of history, not formally dissolved into something else, not officially concluded, quietly, completely gone. That is the thing I cannot stop turning over. The mainstream explanation for this is coherent, and I want you to hear it as it genuinely deserves to be heard. Tartaria, historians will tell you, was never a political entity. It was a geographic label, a cartographic catch-all, applied to the vast, poorly understood steppes and forests east of the Urals. The term derived from the Tatars, the Mongol and Turkic peoples who had swept across Central Asia under Genghis Khan in the 13th century. European mapmakers, lacking detailed knowledge of the interior, used Tartaria the way you label an unexplored margin. Here is where the Tatars range, essentially. A geographic gesture, not a political claim. As Russian imperial expansion pushed steadily eastward through the 17th and 18th centuries, the territory became better known, better mapped, and more precisely subdivided. The old catch-all label became obsolete, replaced by accurate geography. Tartaria didn't vanish dramatically, it was simply resolved into its known component parts. That is a satisfying answer. I held that explanation for a long time before I started noticing what it doesn't account for. And it doesn't account for quite a lot. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, in the details, the way an argument begins to loosen at its edges when you press it with specific questions. Start with the maps themselves. The cartographic record of Tartaria spans roughly the late 14th century to the 1840s, and across that span, the maps are not uniformly vague. They are not uniform at all. They become, over time, more internally detailed, more administratively specific, not less. That is not how placeholders behave. Guillaume Delisle's 1706 map of Tartary, and Delisle was the royal cartographer of France, not a fringe figure, shows internal regional divisions, labelled with notable precision. He distinguishes between Muscovite Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and independent Tartary. These are not vague gestures. These are named subdivisions, drawn with the confidence of recognized geographic boundaries. Then there is Philipp Johann von Strahlenberg, a Swedish military officer captured at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, and held as a prisoner in Siberia for 13 years. He spent that time systematically documenting the territory around him and the people who moved through it. When he returned to Europe and published his findings in 1730, they were detailed enough to be cited by European scholars for decades afterward. He presented Tartary with ethnographic categories, linguistic groupings, and internal regional distinctions. This was not a man projecting imagination onto a blank space. He had lived inside it. Nicholas Whitsun is another figure I keep returning to. A Dutch statesman, mayor of Amsterdam, director of the Dutch East India Company, who spent decades corresponding with Peter the Great's court and with travelers inside the Russian interior. His 1692 map of Tartary described trade networks, hierarchies, and functioning population centers. Whitsun is a well-documented historical figure, and his descriptions of Tartary have a quality that labels for empty space typically do not carry. They describe movement, exchange, and administered territory. They describe something that was operating, not simply occupying space. That distinction is present in the primary sources if you go and read them. Here is where the pattern begins, and I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I am not claiming these documents prove a unified Tartarian empire existed. I am saying they consistently describe something more internally organized than a label for ungoverned space, and that across different nations and different cartographic traditions push forward into the 19th century, when Tartaria's presence on maps begins its rapid retreat. This is the period when Russian imperial expansion is reaching its most aggressive phase under Alexander I and then Nicholas I. The Khanates are falling. The Khanate of Crimea had already been absorbed in 1783 under Catherine the Great. The Khanate of Khiva, the Khanate of Kokand, the Emirate of Bukhara. These are real political entities with documented histories, and they fell one after another through the first half of the 19th century into Russian control. This is not disputed. The expansion is one of the best documented imperial projects of the era, and yet here is what I find curious. The internal record of how these transitions happened, the communications from within, the accounts of resistance, the voices of the territories themselves, is strikingly sparse compared to the Russian imperial record of the same period. One side of that story is abundant, the other is thin. I want to pause and take the counter-argument seriously, because it is a fair one. The peoples of Central Asia in this period were predominantly oral cultures. Their administrative records, where they existed, were often not maintained in ways that would survive conquest and integration into a literate imperial bureaucracy. That accounts for a great deal. It explains the loss of local chronicles, the silence of steppe administrative records. I accept it. What it does not fully account for is the behaviour of the European record, the cartographers, the travellers, the correspondence, which also goes quiet at a specific moment and in a specific way. Look at the travel literature. The 18th century produced a remarkable body of writing about the Tartarian interior. Strahlenberg, Whitsun, and Peter Simon Pallas, the naturalist who travelled across the Russian Empire in the 1760s and 1770s, and described its peoples and territories in extraordinary ethnographic depth. That literature exists, and it is not suppressed. But try to find its equivalent for roughly 1800 to 1850, specifically accounts of the final years of the independent interior territories described from perspectives that were not those of the absorbing empire, not the Russian accounts of expansion, which are rich, the accounts from the other direction. Those are remarkably scarce. The 72-hour framing, and I want to be honest that this specific language belongs to a strand of modern speculation rather than primary source documentation, is, underneath its dramatic shorthand, asking something simpler. Was there a final concentrated moment of resistance that would have been actively inconvenient for the surviving record to preserve? Because empires, when they fall, almost always produce that final moment in the record, a last dispatch, a last administrative act, a compressed period during which the thing that was decides it cannot continue to be. That period almost always leaves traces, except occasionally when it doesn't. Here is the coordination problem, and I want to state it carefully. I am not suggesting a conspiracy. I am not naming a room where decisions were made or hands that were shaken. What I am observing is something historians of empire have recognized in other contexts. Institutional silence can organize itself without explicit coordination. The Russian imperial administration had an obvious interest in presenting the absorption of Central Asian territories as the natural extension of civilization into ungoverned space. The Qing dynasty, managing its own western frontiers in the same period, had parallel interests in presenting those same territories as historically peripheral. These are not small regional powers. The European cartographic establishment, for its part, followed imperial patronage with the fidelity that cartographic establishments always have. Maps are politically sensitive documents. When the powers that fund maps agree, however informally, however structurally, that a particular designation is obsolete, the designation becomes obsolete, not by edict, by institutional gravity. I want to be fair to this process because it is not inherently sinister. This is how knowledge gets organized. The concept of Christendom faded from maps without anyone ordering its removal. Categories die when the powers that sustain them stop finding them useful. This is a normal feature of how political geography works, but there is a difference between a label that gradually thins and one that is actively replaced. The word Tartaria does not gradually thin. It is robust and increasingly detailed through the mid-18th century, and then it retreats with a speed that is conspicuously inconsistent with the slow pace at which geographic knowledge normally evolves. Look at the dates carefully. Delisle's 1706 map, Tartaria fully present, internally subdivided. Strahlenberg's 1730 publication, Tartaria ethnographically rich and internally coherent. Major European atlases of the 1740s, Tartaria prominently labelled and widely accepted. By the 1840s, in the same cartographic tradition, the word is largely gone, replaced by Russian administrative nomenclature. That is roughly 100 years, which sounds gradual until you set it against the 4 centuries of consistent presence that preceded it. And more troubling than the speed is the completeness. When a label becomes obsolete, it lingers in older texts and scholarly marginalia. It echoes. Tartaria's echo is remarkably disproportionately faint. There are answers to this too, and I want to name them honestly. The late 19th century brought the professional institutionalization of history as an academic discipline. University departments, systematic archives, formalized criteria for what constituted legitimate historical subject matter. In that reorganization, the history of the steppe was filed in a specific way. Central Asian history became a subspecialty. The peoples of the interior became subjects of ethnography and anthropology rather than political history. Their past was organized into a framework that treated them as peripheral, as the background against which the real historical actors, the empires, moved and decided. That is a real and documented institutional bias. That bias accounts for much. It explains why the political history of the independent Tartarian Khanates occupies a fraction of the scholarly attention that Russian expansion receives. It explains why the voices of the interior are refracted entirely through the records of the powers that absorbed them. I accept all of that, and I hold it carefully. What I cannot fully resolve, and this is where I keep arriving, regardless of which direction I approach it from, is the question of the final transition itself. Not the broad arc of absorption, which is well documented. The specific granular account of how the last organized structures of that interior actually ended, when the Khanate of Siberia fell to Yermak Timofeyevich's Cossack forces at the Battle of Chuvash Cape in 1582. That battle is documented. It has a date, a location, a chronicle entry. It appears in the record the way military events of significance tend to appear, attached to a specific moment, a specific place. The later absorptions, the territories occupying what the maps had consistently called independent Tartary, are documented at the level of treaty and imperial proclamation. The Russian record says, this territory was absorbed on this date under these terms. What it does not often say is what those terms replaced, or what resisted them. And here, I want to say this carefully. The absence is not of records in general, it is of a specific type of record. The absence is of accounts that would describe what the final years of independent Tartarian organization actually looked like, from a perspective that was not the absorbing power's own. That asymmetry alone could be explained by what I named earlier: oral culture, disrupted archives, the normal violence of conquest replacing one record-keeping tradition with another. I keep checking myself against those explanations, but I have been sitting with the maps long enough to notice something that sits just outside their reach. The maps show, across different cartographic traditions and different national interests, a Tartaria that is more organized than a geographic placeholder would need to be. French maps, Dutch maps, German maps, British maps, not identical in their depictions, but agreeing on more than they should if all were simply projecting imagination onto the same interior. There is one more thing, and I have been saving it not for dramatic effect, but because the argument needed to earn the right to reach it. In the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689, the first formal treaty between the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty, two empires sat down to draw a line. That treaty is real. The Jesuit translators who negotiated it, Thomas Pereira and Jean-François Gerbillon, are real historical figures whose accounts of the proceedings survive. What survives in those accounts is the imperial side, what the two empires agreed to, where the line was drawn, what each received. What does not survive in comparable depth is any account of what the territory between those empires understood to be happening. The line was drawn through something. Two empires acknowledged that something existed implicitly by the act of dividing it, and then, over the following century and a half, they both replaced the word for it. On every map their influence could reach, in every cartographic tradition that depended on their patronage. That is documented. That is not speculation. The question, the only question I am actually asking, is what that convergence means, and why it happened with the completeness and the speed that the record shows. I keep returning to the nature of institutional silence because I think it is something most people misunderstand. Silence is not absence. Silence is a shape. When the same silence appears in the same place across documents produced by different hands, in different languages, under different flags, that is not nothing. That is a pattern. The silence around the final years of independent Tartarian organization is not the silence of emptiness, not the void left by something that never existed. It is the silence of a shape that was clearly present and then went undescribed. Whether that means suppression or simply the weight of imperial indifference, I genuinely cannot say. What I can say is that the question of what happened in the final decades, not the broad sweep of imperial history, but the specific, compressed period when the last organized structures of the interior resolved, that question has not been answered with the granularity that the surviving evidence suggests it deserves. The 72-hour framing is dramatic shorthand for something that is really just an absence in the documentary record. The shorthand is speculative, the absence is real. And sometimes the most important thing you can do with an absence is simply point at it carefully and ask why it is shaped exactly the way it is. Because here is what I have learned from sitting with this long enough. The shape of what is missing tells you almost as much as the shape of what remains. The Tartaria that 4 centuries of maps described, with increasing internal detail and growing cartographic confidence, deserved a more complete ending than history gave it. Something was present, something closed. I do not know what name to give the final hours of whatever that was. I do not know if there was a siege, a dissolution, a slow absorption that left no legible scar. What I know is that every map that showed it clearly was eventually replaced without full explanation, and that is where I keep arriving. Not at an answer, at a door. A door shaped like the outline of a word that 400 years of cartographers agreed to draw, and that the next generation agreed, just as quietly, to stop, on every map, in every language, at roughly the same moment. I don't know what's on the other side of it, but I know the door is there, and the more carefully I look at the silence around it, the more certain I am that someone reached out a deliberate hand and closed it. What I don't know, what I may never know, is why.